All right, everybody. We are going to be talking about the vice presidential debate. Didn't think we would, but we're going to talk about voter fraud. And if we have time, which we probably won't, we'll talk about COVID on episode 264 of the In the Tank podcast. As always, I am your host, Donald Kendal. And joining me, I've got the normal crew. I've got Justin Haskins, editorial director here at the Heartland Institute. How are you, good sir?
I'm doing better now that I'm with you, guys.
Oh, how flattering.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, I'm doing so much. You know, I know that... I know. I just want to briefly just rant for a second.
Oh, God.
I think it's really important in a civilized society for people, when they make appointments with other people, to keep those appointments and plans and schedules. I admit that I'm late to everything. I understand that, but I don't cancel typically, okay? Unless there's an emergency or something like that. All right?
Where are you going with this?
And I just want to say there are certain producers of certain shows that have been canceling, quite a bit, quite frequently lately, and several times this week, in fact. And if they cancel again, I'm going to go on a killing spree. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, that's on. It's on. Okay, well, there you go.
That's it. That's all I'm saying.
Isaac Orr, research fellow at the Center of the American Experiment. How are you, good sir?
Good.
All right, fantastic.
Howdy ho, everybody.
More stuff on the walls. Jim Lakely, VP of the Heartland Institute. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm looking forward to talking about the vice presidential debate last night because, I would categorize that as a mostly peaceful butt kicking by Mike Pence.
I
enjoyed it.
So I knew that there was going to be a VP debate. I think I asked Justin yesterday when we were talking on the phone, like, is that tonight? He told me that it was. Like, I guess we're going to have to talk about it a little bit. I'm like, but nobody cares. It's a VP debate. We don't have to talk about it for that long. Then I watched it, and I thought it was actually a very interesting debate.
It's the best debate we're going to get in terms of substance this go around. Like,
I think so.
That's the thing. Like, if you actually want to know where either campaign stands on an issue, go watch that debate, because it's the only one where you're not going to get like, oh, Joe Biden's a doo-doo head. And it's like, listen here, Jack. Come on, man.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, essentially.
The thing.
So by the end of the first debate, I was just like, just end my misery here. I want it to end. And this debate, I was like, I could watch this for another hour. I thought it was actually refreshing. So I'm a little inspired to talk about this a little bit more. I mean, we don't have to go into like the basics. Like, I think everybody knows, especially if you watch the debate, that Mike Pence destroyed. I think he just crushed Kamala Harris. Isaac shaking his head, but he didn't even watch it. So discount his last comments that he made. But
I don't think I agree with that. But
really,
yeah, I don't think so.
Well, you were probably the most critical of Trump during the first debate or after the first debate. So,
well, me and the rest of America, because it's poll numbers.
No. I said the most.
But...
I said the most critical. I think I was critical, but I think you were the most. That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
Jim was uncritical.
Yeah,
Jim
I would say
like,
Jim was not critical.
I was pretty uncritical. Oh,
he
yeah.
had the Trump steak flavored
Okay.
bootlicking.
Yeah, my little tiny Trump. He's in COVID isolation right now. He'd be out here on the podcast with me. So
good.
No, you're right, Isaac. Actually, last night's debate was actually very substantive. It kind of, it was like a time warp back to the 90s or something.
Yeah, wasn't it like kind of a horrible return to the normalcy? Like, it wasn't nearly as entertaining, was it?
Well, it was a reminder of how boring politics can be. In the age of Trump, politics is anything really but boring, and he's anything but boring. There's always something exciting going on, and it could be a disaster. It could be great. It could be, what was that? It could be all sorts of different things. But last night was pretty normal. Back to normal for that. But I just have to point out, as a former member of the media in the Washington D.C., the White House press corps, it was yet another, and every single debate of my entire adult life has been moderated by leftists, by liberal journalists who ask frame every question and every issue just the way the Democrats would. Kamala Harris didn't get any challenging questions that, challenged her campaigns in the Biden. Is it the Harris-Biden campaign or the Biden-Harris campaign? I get it confused.
It changes every week.
Yeah, it does. But they get no challenging questions on the things that would make them look bad or things that would be hard for them to answer. And again, Mike Pence is the one who had to bring up all those questions because the moderator wasn't going to do it. One of these days, it would be, if it's just going to be this way, where basically a Democratic National Committee hack is going to be asking the questions of both candidates. Why isn't there a Republican National Committee hack asking Kamala questions and then a Democrat asking Pence questions? At least that would be a semblance of fairness, but it's always the same thing. And I don't know if it frustrates everyone else as much as it does me, because, it's the framing of these issues that really, shapes the way the American people think about things. And if everything is always framed as if the Democratic position is good, right, and reasonable, and then it's always you have to defend yourself as a Republican in these debates instead of just being able to explain what your policies are. And it's always on the Republican, as it was for Trump in the first debate and Pence last night, to actually present the challenging questions like court packing, which we're going to get into in this podcast.
Well, I think
Dustin,
every time that we refer to it as a debate, I think we should put it in quotes, because there's rarely debate. I was reading an article and I think that they summed it up best. I put it in the show notes, but they described this as less of a debate and more of a joint news conference. And that's essentially what it is. It's just he said this. Well, I'm saying this. No, you said that. They're not really debating, really. They're not getting to any substance of the topics. Rarely ever. And if they do, it's time to move on to the next topic. So it's rarely a debate. But yeah, sure, Justin, weigh in.
All right. I should just walk off the show right now.
Isaac, how about you?
I should just walk off the show right now. No, look, here's the you're getting me mad. You're getting me
heated,
really
man.
angry.
You are heated.
I'm really not. I'm not. That's the thing. I think that the debate almost had two parts to it. I think there was the COVID part, which was the first maybe 20 minutes of the debate or so, and then there was everything else. And I think that the COVID part of the debate, I think Pence was terrible. I thought he was really bad. I don't think he did well on those questions at all. He didn't answer a lot of the questions. Kamala Harris's she had lots of things that she said that were just ridiculous that he never really addressed fully. What would you have done differently to save all these lives that you supposedly are saying we lost, that it was our fault? What would you have done differently? What would you have actually done to save? He never even asked that question. But the other thing is, the main thing was, she kept going back to this Bob Woodward story about them finding out, Pence and Trump finding out about this thing in late January, and then not telling the American people about it. And I thought that was actually a really effective argument on her part. She was basically saying, hey, look, they knew about it before you knew about it, and they could have told you, and they didn't tell you, and instead they kept you in the dark. And if you had known earlier, think about how you may have changed your life, how you would have done things differently. I think that was a very, very strong argument. Now, the answer to that, if you're Mike Pence, is to say, look, I was in those meetings. You weren't in those meetings. Bob Woodward wasn't in those meetings. And we had experts telling us all sorts of different things. And we weren't sure on January, 28th, what the right answer was. We were still trying to figure that out. The World Health Organization at that point in time was basically parroting back Chinese Communist Party talking points, saying there's nothing really going on here. Everything's going to be okay. You don't even need a travel ban. And so they didn't know what the answer. And instead of saying that, he just totally dodged it. And she brought it up not just once, but I believe twice, maybe even 3 times. And he never addresses it. He just pretends that she never said it. And I thought that was a really weak point for him. And I think that made him look really bad. I don't think he had a very good argument for how they handled things. And I think that he can, just like Donald Trump, has made the mistake of acting as though this really was all up to them. And they did a decent job, or they didn't do a decent job, when in reality, as people who are involved in policy know, the states are the ones that make most of the policies related to shutting down the economy, public safety, wearing masks. It's not Donald Trump. It's not the federal government. They're not making those decisions. And instead of pointing that out and saying, hey, look, if you have a problem with the way a lot of this stuff was handled, why don't you point the finger at Democrat governors in California and in New York and in places like that? Why don't you blame them? And she didn't. He didn't say that. He didn't bring that up. He instead allowed that assumption to exist, to hang in the air, which is totally false. And so I thought it was a huge missed opportunity for him to sort of correct the record on a lot of the standard lies that you hear from Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. And I thought Kamala Harris's argument about them not talking about this was a really powerful argument. And he chooses deliberately not to address it. And that was a huge mistake. Everything else, I think Mike Pence won. But I think that was such an important part. And it was at the very beginning of the debate. That's the thing that's going to have the highest viewership. And so I think from that perspective, I think he did very poorly in that part. But then the rest of it, I thought he was much better than her.
He was basically asked, why did you let 200,000 Americans die when you could have stopped it? I mean, that was the setup of the question. And he did have an answer to it, Justin. He talked about Operation Warp Speed to get a vaccine. He talked about the PPE got into all the hospitals. He talked about the mobilization of the private sector and the government to getting them supplies where they needed to be to deal with what turned out to not be huge spikes in people needing ventilators, for instance, in hospitals. He actually talked about it all. He brought all of that up. And then when Kamala Harris was actually for once challenged on, well, what would you do differently? She basically said the same stuff. And, Pence had one of his best lines of the night saying, that sounds a lot like plagiarism, which is something Joe Biden knows a little bit about. I just disagree with you that he blew it on the COVID thing, especially with the way the question was set up. The Trump team actually, all things considered, has a pretty good record on this. Oh, yeah. And again, he brought up the ban on travel from China when everybody was telling him not to do it. And that Joe Biden said was xenophobic and shouldn't have been done. So, what else is he supposed to say? Literally, what else is he supposed to say about that?
Well,
those are the things he said. Can talk about the fact that Governor Cuomo Amazon primed the virus to people in nursing homes. Like,
right.
He could have brought that up. You're right.
That would have been a huge thing.
He could have answered her question.
Yeah.
Which he did not answer, that's my point. He didn't answer the question. The most important question, he didn't answer. That's my whole point. He was asked twice, why didn't you, or he was accused twice
I have
of
the question right
deliberately
here.
covering it up. That's what he was accused of doing 2 times. And instead of answering that and saying, no, we weren't covering it up, there was an explanation and a reason for it, he essentially dodged it and didn't ever answer that question.
The question on covering up was from Harris, not from Susan Page.
I know that.
Yeah, the question from Susan Page. Again, I'm not exaggerating. Why is the U.S. death toll as a percentage of our population higher than almost every other wealthy country? You have 2 minutes. In other words, why are there so many dead people? Explain yourself, sir. I mean,
well, and he didn't answer that question.
He did answer that question.
No, he didn't. He never said why there's a difference between the death toll here and the death toll someplace else. He never answered that question.
Because it's a garbage question.
So you don't answer it? You don't address it?
That's a fair question to ask. You don't think
you answer it with Isaac's response about the Amazon priming it to the people that are most susceptible to this disease.
Ask Andrew Cuomo. Ask the governor, or Chris Christie. Is he the governor of New Jersey anymore? I forget.
Yeah, the answer to the question is that the governors of New York and New Jersey and Connecticut put old people back into nursing homes that had COVID. If it wasn't for that, we would. And actually, even with that, we are not so much worse than other Western countries around the world. We're actually about in the middle of the pack. So he could have said that, but nobody wants to.
That's my point, though. So there's lots of things he could have said. That's the point that I'm making. He didn't say those things. That's the point.
That's per capita. We're 10.
Yeah, per capita we're 10. Right. Out of how many countries that are comparable wealth.
Here are the only 9 countries that are doing worse than us in that metric: San Marino, Peru, Belgium, Bolivia, Andorra, Brazil, Spain, Chile, Ecuador. Then it's us. So that's a real question that they have to be prepared to answer.
I don't think that's right.
I'm on worldometers.
You're a worldometer. I want to talk about the court packing thing, because to me, I think this is the most important part. Justin, you went on a rant, I think it was last week, talking about how if they do get into office, they do take over the Senate and they shove another 4 or 5 justices onto the Supreme Court, that will lead to just absolute chaos. Am I putting words in your mouth? That pretty much sums it up, right? Pretty much. Yeah. So, Andy, Mr. Producer, can you get that first clip of the Supreme Court packing during the debate? So this was a kind of a back and forth that I was going to just describe because I didn't want to make you all have to listen to Kamala Harris talk for a couple of minutes. But Jim suggested we play the video. So why don't we go ahead and just play it here? If we could hear it. Oh, Andy.
Wah, 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 wah.
So court packing, I was wondering if this is just like a thing that's people even know, like the term, like I assume people listening to this podcast know, but just the average person know that packing the court has to do with, like we have 9 justices on the Supreme Court, and they want to just because they don't like the balance of conservative and liberals, they just want to add more liberals once they get into office. Like, is that common knowledge? Like, do people understand what packing the court is if you were to just say it to somebody on the street?
Absolutely not.
Well, they do now, just say adding more members of the Supreme Court.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm wondering, because I'm just thinking the average person watching this debate, when they hear them talking about, are you going to pack the Supreme Court? Do they know exactly what that means? So I just wanted to kind of really make that clear. Go ahead, Andy. Oh my gosh.
And the sound is off again.
Man.
Technical difficulties. Well, I could just describe it. So this is technology saving you from having to listen to Kamala Harris. So Pence asked
Johnny,
Kamala,
be nice. Be nice. Andy, can you get it going?
Oh my gosh.
So I'm going to describe it in the meantime. But Pence asked Kamala Harris if they plan on packing the Supreme Court if elected. He discusses how that we've had 9 justices on the Supreme Court for 150 years. She thanks Pence with her little smirking face for the history lesson and says, let's talk about history. And then goes on to talk about Lincoln not appointing a Supreme Court justice 27 days before the election, because that is obviously super relevant to the question. Pence says, that's not an answer. Are you planning on packing the Supreme Court? He didn't let the subject die, thankfully. To which she says, let's talk about packing the Supreme Court, which the let's talk about thing is so, God, is that cringy. So then Pence interrupts saying, why won't you give us a straight answer? And she says, I'm trying to answer you. I'm talking right now. I'm trying to answer you.
I'm speaking. I'm speaking.
Yeah.
I'm speaking.
So then Pence says, okay, go ahead, answer it. And then she talks about Trump appointing conservative justices to the federal courts and then says that none of them are black. And then that's the end of the discussion. So then Pence notes again, he's like, I just want the record to show that she will not answer the question, to which she just smirks. And then they move on. Again,
yes, they move on. And it should be pointed out again that this topic only came up because Mike Pence mentioned it. This packing, adding, changing the number of justices on the Supreme Court from 9 to 11 or 13 or 15 would be the most radical change in our system of government, really, since the Constitution, since the Constitution was first written and before the amendments were put in. This would be tyranny on steroids. The left, if the Democrats have the White House, the House of Representatives, and the Senate, of course, and they decide to pack the court, there's nothing to stop them. And then after that, there's nothing to stop there's nothing to stop a majority from just overrunning any minority in this country. Any minority viewpoint is all just squashed. This would be tyranny. This is exactly what this would be. And it's not discussed. It's not brought up. Kamala Harris is on record saying, absolutely, I'd be in favor of packing the court. Absolutely, she said. And it's up to Pence, again, to bring it up. This should be one of the first questions asked after COVID is the future of the Supreme Court, the future of our very constitutional order of government.
Yeah,
this is a big deal.
I thought that was the takeaway. If you after the stuff that we talked about last week, where Trump brought it up about packing the Supreme Court and Biden dodged it, and then we played that other video of Biden being directly asked during an interview whether or not he'd be for Supreme Court, and he just changes the subject, and we're just basically speculating, doesn't this mean that they're for it? If they weren't going to do it, then they would just say they weren't going to do it, But this, to me, especially because Pence directly asked her 3 times and she just absolutely refused to answer it. To me, I don't think you can get much more of a confirmation that this is what their plan is.
Well, Mike Pence said exactly. I want the record to reflect that she never answered the question. Maybe in the next debate, Joe Biden will answer the question, but I think the American people know the answer. Of course, we know the answer.
Right.
Well, in fairness, I think that it's possible you could make the argument that the reason they won't answer the question isn't necessarily because that's the plan, but rather because they know that if they answer the question and they say, no, we're not going to pack the court, it's going to make all of the far left people really mad.
Yep.
If they say yes,
I don't buy it.
If they say yeah, well, it will. It definitely will. There's no question about that. Won't you agree with that? That it will, in fact, make them mad?
Maybe, but why did that stop them from kind of denouncing the Green New Deal like 5 minutes later?
What do you mean?
Isn't that gonna make all the far lefties mad too? But they did that.
Denouncing the Green New Deal? When did they denounce the Green New Deal?
They basically tried to do it all throughout the debate, and Biden said that he wasn't in favor of the Green New Deal in the last debate. And that's when Trump was like, "Oh, you just lost all the lefties."
He did.
That's hilarious.
The thing is, I mean, I don't know the answer to that question, but I think Biden deliberately. I mean, Biden said his answer to his question in the last debate was, "If I answer this question," I'm paraphrasing, but it was basically, "If I answer this question, my answer will become the news or whatever. That will become the issue. My answer." So that is him saying, I don't want to say it because if I say it, it's going to make a bunch of people mad.
But
one way or the other.
News. If he said no, and we're just going by the norms of the last 150 years, that would not be a news story.
We're not going by the norms of the last 150 years. We're burning down police stations in the streets and tearing down statues of George Washington and beheading them and lighting them on fire. The norms are dead, Donald. I know you want to go back and live in 1990s, with Seinfeld and Friends and Bill Clinton and all that, but we can't have it. It's over.
Much simpler times. Simpler times.
It's over. We are in some sort of funhouse mirror distortion of reality now. That's our new world where I can't go outside without wearing a mask on my face. Okay?
I just don't buy it. And maybe this kind of jumps right into the next topic where we're talking about fracking, because the whole thing is trying to hold them to account of their stances on fracking over the last, during the primary campaign, where both of them are talking about how they want to get rid of all fossil fuels. Turns out natural gas is a fossil fuel. And they're distancing themselves from those statements that they made.
But on that one, these to me are not the same thing, because everybody on the left knows that they're gonna ban fossil fuels because they've said that. They're very clear about it. It's on their website still. They're not denying that. And everybody on the left knows banning fossil fuels includes banning fracking. But they can come out and say we're not going to ban fracking, and other people who don't know any better are going to think, oh, they're not going to ban fracking. Yep. So it's the left is not going to get mad about that because they understand that it's a political lie meant to confuse people who don't know what fracking is or what the purpose of it for or what Joe Biden's other policies are. So I think the two things are a little bit different. The court packing thing is different because the left knows if Amy Coney Barrett goes through and becomes a Supreme Court justice, they have lost control of the court and they are in big, big, big trouble. Big trouble. They know that. And they want to pack the court desperately. They want it. And so if they come out and say, no, we're not going to do that, then it is going to make those people mad. Without question, it will make them mad. And I think that at this point in time, they just don't want to answer the question because they know that either way, they're going to make somebody angry and they're going to lose voters. And they're in a situation now where they're going to win. They think they're going to win based on the polls. So the way they look at it is we just have to hold the lead here by not screwing it up. So why answer a question like that? Let it hang out there. Let it look bad. Fine, whatever. It doesn't matter. And we'll win anyway, just by default. But if we take a firm position one way or the other, then that becomes a big news story and we're going to lose votes one way or the other.
And that hamstrings them in the future, too, if they do make it into office. So I think that Justin's on the right track there.
I don't know. I think that I really don't think so. It's like, no, we're not going to do something that hasn't been done in 150 years, and that's going to outrage their base.
Yep.
No,
I absolutely think that's the case.
Justin is absolutely right about this, because if it was otherwise, he would just lie and say, no, we wouldn't do something like that. And then after getting elected, go ahead and do it. They can't say no because it'll piss off the left. That's why he can't say no. I mean,
all right. Well, let's
he's
talk about
flip-flop-
fracking then.
Yeah,
Let's talk about fracking then, because on fracking, we had a very similar situation here, except for they did the opposite of what you guys are suggesting they're doing on this topic. So, again, Pence tried to hold Harris's feet to the fire by talking about how, they're actually for banning fracking, to which she says Biden will not ban fracking. That is a fact. So this is true. Despite, him saying in the past that he's for it, Biden is now saying that he won't ban fracking. However, as we discussed in a previous episodes, the policies that Biden wants to put into place will essentially it'll be like a de facto ban on fracking. It's like, no, I don't want to ban guns, but I'm just going to levy $1 million tax on every new gun that's being produced.
No. I actually think I thought of this exact kind of scenario, and really what it's like is, no, we're not going to ban guns, but we're going to ban all the bullets. No bullets.
Right.
So yeah, you can have a gun, but it's worthless. It's like that. You can frack. Sure, you can go fracking if you want, I guess, but you can't do anything with the stuff that you get out of the ground. It's like, that's the idea I think that they're going for. It's so obviously, it is such a lie. It is amazing how much of a lie it is. When you're telling everybody that you're going to have the entire electric grid be, carbon neutral or CO2 emissions free in 15 years or something like that.
Yep.
And then you also say, but we're not going to ban fracking. It's like, what are you talking about? And then they even go even further and say, and by 2050, we're going to be totally carbon neutral all across the whole economy. And it's like, well, then what's the point of fracking then? Like, what are you supposed to do with this? You're going to ban it, so we can't even sell it if we wanted to, the stuff we actually get from fracking.
Yep.
So it's so obvious the bottom line is this: if you have a job in fracking or related to fracking, or you benefit from fracking in any way, which is basically everyone, then you are not in a better situation as a result of this. Like, that's the bottom line. You're either going to lose your job, or you're going to lose your economic output, or your energy costs are going to be higher. That's the bottom line. And it is incredible, as Jim pointed out. It is an example of bias on the part of the moderator to not ask that kind of a question and make it clear that that's a really good question. You say you don't support a ban on fracking, but your policies, don't they necessarily require, all the fracking jobs to go away? Isn't that the same thing? That would be a really great question, and no one is asking.
Here's the deal, Jack. It's all about Pennsylvania. That's all this is. The lip service that they pay to fracking and not banning it is all about Pennsylvania, first and foremost, I think. Also, like Texas. They're never going to actually flip Texas if they're going to say, oh, yeah, state with the highest oil and gas output. You can't do that anymore. So, yeah, this is just a political calculus, and it's all baloney. It's malarkey. It's pure malarkey.
There you go. I thought, the malarkey tour for Biden. That's great. No, I mean, look, a good moderator would have interrupted her or pressed her on the idea. Well, wait a minute. Your boss, the top of the ticket, Joe Biden, held the hand of an environmental activist at a campaign event, held her hand and said, look in my eyes. I will ban fracking.
Ew, did he really do that?
He did that. That was not that long ago. He said on another campaign stop that he was going to ban fracking. You, Kamala Harris, have said in that. Remember when we did the podcast about the CNN climate change telethon? Yeah, that was awesome. Yeah, during her portion of the climate change telethon on CNN, she said. She was asked, would you ban fracking? Absolutely. Absolutely, I would ban fracking.
Yeah, right.
And so
she's definitely on the record. Yeah.
It's not like you have to dig very hard to find these things. They were popping up all over Twitter live during the debate the other night.
Yeah.
You press them on. So when they say, and actually, if you think of her phrasing, it's actually incorrect just on its face. She says, I think she said, Joe Biden will not ban fracking. That's a fact. Well, wait a minute. That's not a fact. That's like saying Jim Lakely will not eat cheeseburgers. Well, I could change my mind and want a cheeseburger, and it's pretty damn likely I am going to want a cheeseburger. So it can't be a fact that I will not eat a cheeseburger. And it cannot be a fact that he will not ban fracking. How the hell can you say that's a fact? It's not a fact. She says it that way. She says it that way because she can't say that Joe Biden said he would not ban fracking. Oh, so he said that, but he has said he would ban fracking over and over and over again. and that's to make sure that their leftist environmental nut jobs are happy.
So a president can't really just ban fracking, though. They don't have the authority to just wave a magic wand and ban fracking. Otherwise, Obama would have done it. So most fracking is done on private land. That's all regulated by the states. The EPA can do a whole bunch of things to try to do a death by 1,000 cuts like they did on the coal industry. But like they can't just come out and ban it, right?
They can ban it on federal land, and they can make the EPA make it so compliance expensive that it would basically throttle the industry.
They could also
true.
Right. They could also make it illegal to like transport natural gas across state lines and stuff like that, which wouldn't
that require an act of Congress though? Like, wouldn't that require? I mean, Congress could ban fracking for sure.
And well, that's what she means, I think.
Yeah.
I think that's what the plan is, right? Is to have some kind of an act of Congress. But you're right. A president just can't come in there and arbitrarily do that. They would have to do what Jim was suggesting with the EPA and all of that other stuff.
Oh. Not if they wave around the idea of a climate emergency, which makes them have to take in extra presidential powers or something like that.
That's where we're headed.
Counting anything. Yeah.
That's true.
So I wish that Pence would have said, because she's like, that's a fact. He's not going to ban fracking. I wish Pence would have said like, well, how does that make you feel? Like as being somebody that's like been so outwardly anti-fracking and the co-sponsor of the Green New Deal, even, which was pointed out during this
first
debate.
one. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just like, how does that make you feel? Like, are you disappointed in Trump or in Biden for not wanting to ban fracking?
Yeah, you're going to try to get him to change his mind when you're
Right?
president and he's taking a nap.
I would love for that for them to have pressed her on that. It would have been hilarious because like you said, she was like the first co-sponsor of it. So
yeah, there was a section in here that I thought Pence missed an opportunity to really skewer Harris. She was talking about California and climate change and the fires and stuff like that, and how like California is leading the nation on clean energy. And all he had to do was say, you can't keep the lights on.
Right.
You have rolling blackouts because the sun goes down. And he really just punted on this. He started talking about, oh, well, you want to raise taxes. And it's just like, that's completely unrelated, sir.
Yeah.
So yeah, there were definitely times last night. I mean, nobody's perfect, right? But like that would have been such a coup de grace.
Yeah.
And
I agree. The raising taxes thing, I get it, but
it was super weak.
It's like when you're talking about like the world ending, like that's the context that we're all talking in. Raising taxes seems like okay.
That actually I think is the biggest missed opportunity. There was actually a pretty good question. The question was, do you believe that climate change is an existential threat? And I think if Mike Pence essentially, mumbled his way through that by saying, we believe what the science says and whatever that means. But what he should have said is, no, I don't believe it's an existential threat, because existential threat means all human beings on the face of the planet are going to be wiped out by climate change. And I think that that's a ludicrous argument. And I think that anyone who says that it's an existential threat is a nut job. And Kamala Harris over here has said it numerous times. Joe Biden has said it numerous times. It is not an existential threat. And anyone who thinks that it is not even listening to the climate alarmist scientists who don't even say that it's an existential threat. Literally nobody, no actual scientist is calling it an existential threat to human civilization and life on Earth. Like literally nobody, not even the UN does that. Okay. So the idea that that question is presented to you and you just don't turn that around and say, this is all about fear mongering. And this is the fact that they keep using this phrase existential threat is proof of it. There is no evidence, zero, absolutely none, not even in alarmist climate models that suggest that all human beings are going to die. There's nothing that says that. And all he had to do was point that out and point out how ridiculous it is and how much fear mongering it is. And that would have forced her to answer it would have been a very awkward moment for her, because she's called it an existential threat a million times. So what does she say there? What do you say if you're her at this point? You backtrack and say, no, actually, I don't think it's an existential threat. Well, then you've just lied all these other times? Or do you double down and say, yes, I do think climate change is going to kill everybody, which would make you sound like a total nutcase. So either way, if she had been pressed on that, it would have made her look really badly. I thought that was a big missed opportunity.
Yeah, just like, you know what's a huge threat? Not having electricity when it's 115 degrees outside. You know what's a huge threat? Not having electricity when you're hooked up to a ventilator or a dialysis machine, or if you're a low-income family and the food in your refrigerator spoils because the sun went down. Like, that was just such a great opportunity. And like, yeah, it's just really bad that he missed that. Like, that would have been that would have been a deal ender right there. Like, that would have been a mic drop. And I think that, yeah, it's too bad we didn't get it.
I was texting with some climate realist friends last night while watching the debate, and there was also disappointment that he didn't say what we would say and what you just said, Justin. Because when you're asked, is climate change an existential threat? The answer is obviously no, and it would be awesome to have a Republican politician actually say no, it's not. It's ridiculous, but I think you have to grade these kind of things on a curve. You guys have watched enough Democrat debates or questioning of Republican politicians by Democrat operatives posing as journalists. And on that curve, I think actually, Pence did relatively well. I mean, he said with regard to climate change, the climate is changing, but the issue is the cause and what do we do about it? That's exactly the position that Heartland takes. And most Republicans won't even say that. They'll just run away. And then he says, we're going to listen to the science. He didn't follow that up by saying the science isn't settled. There's a lot of unanswered questions about the impact, the precise impact of human activity on the climate, on rising seas, all this stuff. He could have gone into that like we always do, but he didn't.
Tucked his tail between his legs. He could have used that as an opportunity to go on the offensive and said, look, California shut down a huge nuclear power plant that produces carbon-free power around the clock. And you guys have blackouts because you think that using 18th century technology is going to be able to power a 21st century economy. You guys are living in a third world country right now. And just being able to slam Kamala Harris, the California senator, for this on energy, on climate, which is the issue that they use to pretend they have a monopoly on science, right? Like, I've talked about this basically every week forever, but like, this is the huge deal. Like, they don't think that physics is a science, even though physics is the most fundamental, like every other branch of science stems from physics, and like, they just pretend that it doesn't exist.
I mean, again, I give him credit for saying that. He says here, well, thank you, Susan. Well, first, I'm very proud of our record on the environment, on conservation. And so he outlined for the audience that there is a difference between environmental activism and the wacko environmental left and the conservation of our environment. He said the truth that our air and water and land is cleaner than probably it's ever been since the Industrial Revolution here in this country. That point is almost never made by Republicans, especially in a national debate. I think you get points for that. I think that's pretty good stuff considering the way the question is set up and the way most Republicans answer those questions.
I agree. I agree with Jim's premise that if you're gonna grade this on the curve, then yeah, I think the answer is not terrible if you're grading on a curve. However, I would also say that the average score in this class is so bad that grading on a curve is probably giving him too much credit in some ways. I think Isaac is right. He definitely tucked his tail between his legs and ran away from it by saying, when asked about the existential climate crisis question, he says, well, we're going to continue listening to the scientists. Like, that's not answering the question. That is running away from it, because you don't want to say, no, it's not an existential crisis, when that's an easy win. That's not a complicated win. It's existential. That means you will not exist. Does anyone really think, and that would have been a great opportunity to just say, Kamala, do you believe that every single human being on the face of the planet is going to die because of climate change? Because that's what you've been telling people. That's what it means. And then you could even say, do you know what existential crisis means? I mean, it would have been a moment to really drive this point home. And Isaac's point, exactly right. She's from California. It's perfect to talk about but I agree. Yeah. So I sort of agree with everybody, I guess, on this particular
it's not
point.
An existential threat. Any difficulties that, come from an ever-changing climate crisis, we'll be able to innovate ourselves out of it and make sure that we protect everybody, whatever. But like these ideas that the solutions that you're putting forward are going to stop any of that from happening are nonsense. It's just going to lead to economic distress and environmental destruction. That's what the answer should
Right. And he harps on the Green New Deal and the taxes and how expensive it's going to be and all of that and getting out of the climate accord, because obviously that kind of stuff has been poll tested and it's a winner for them,
Sure.
So they have to hit the talking points. So, though he may have said something different, or we may have said something different in that situation if given a chance, the things he said, I still believe are pretty good. I would give it a C plus, B minus,
Sure.
On a pretty good scale.
All right, let's move on to what was supposed to be the main topic, but I guess this is the secondary topic now, which is voter fraud. So this is a topic, honestly, that I have not paid super close attention to. I mean, just being exposed to the news cycle, I know that we're 25 days away from the election. One of the biggest stories out there is the voting process itself. COVID is being used as an excuse by states to push more mail-in voting than ever before. So the left says that we need more mail-in voting, to make sure that nobody runs the risk of being exposed to the COVID when they're going to their polling places. The right generally suggests that wide-scale mail-in voting is going to be, just wrought with fraud. And then the left responds saying that the right is trying to suppress voting. And then the right responds saying that they just want to make sure there's no funny business. So, Jim, do I have the news cycle rhetoric down, or am I missing something here?
I think you have it about right. One thing that I find, we can get into particulars. I know in the show notes we're going to have links to some studies that have outlined and tried to track voter fraud. Voter fraud, by the way, that the Democratic Party says does not exist. It's quite clear that it actually does exist on quite a wide scale, varies from state to state, but it certainly exists in every state. And every fraudulent vote that is cast steals your legit vote away. Well, one thing actually I would like just to explore before we even get into that is this idea of voter suppression. It is a mantra of the left and the Democratic Party that the Republicans are, all they want to do is suppress the vote, voter suppression. I don't understand this. I still don't understand it now. Like we have COVID lockdown, so we have to have massive mail-in voting all across the country instantaneously, and to not do that is somehow voter suppression. Look, voter suppression is keeping somebody from going to the polls to be able to vote. It's exceedingly easy to vote in elections in this country. You are bombarded with opportunities to register to vote, from motor voter laws to, advertising campaigns on TV to, you go into any municipal building and they implore you to register to vote. It is not voter suppression just to desire that the people show up at the polls on election day, like we have done for more than 200 years, and then see if they're on the voter roll so that we know who you are, and then register your vote and then go home. I don't understand how anything that is trying to bring some sense of accuracy and legitimacy and legality to something as important as elections, any efforts whatsoever is called voter suppression, and it just hangs out there. And nobody on the right ever pushes back and asks them actually to explain to the American people what exactly do they mean by voter suppression. Because if they were forced to explain, I think most people think you're full of crap.
Yeah. I mean, they accused Trump of voter suppression in the last debate just because he voiced concern over mail-in voting.
Yeah.
So I mean,
How
that's
is
how
that
broad
voter
the definition is. But Justin, you recently wrote an article about this voter fraud concern, this new voter fraud concern. I think for townhall.com. You can correct me if I'm wrong here.
Yep.
So you're probably more informed about this specific topic than anyone else on this podcast. So take us through it. Is this a legitimate concern, or is this just a conservative scare story?
I think that there's a very strong argument that can be made that unless the election is a total blowout in favor of either candidate, but I don't think anyone thinks that Donald Trump is going to totally blow out Joe Biden.
How dare you?
Well, I mean, let's be real here. If Biden wins, it will. If Trump wins, it will be close, at least in some of the states that he needs to win, right? Unless it's a total blowout, I think you could make an argument that it is impossible to say with any sort of certainty that this election is a valid election. And the reason that I say that is because the rules that have been put into place are so terrible, and voter fraud is so easy to do under the rules that have been put into place in many of the states that I think it's really, really hard to say with any confidence that if the election is close, that you know for sure who really did win the election. And so I want to, I know that's sort of a radical thing to say, but I just want to like walk through some of these rules here. All right. There are 45 states in this country right now that are allowing people, anyone essentially, so long as they say that they're afraid of COVID, they're allowed to get a ballot and vote from home. They're allowed to mail in their ballot in 45 states. Okay. You don't need any other justification but that. In 9 states and in the District of Columbia, they don't even require you to do that. They're just sending everybody ballots. Okay. And California is one of those states. California, the largest state in the country, they're sending everyone ballots who's a registered voter, regardless of whether or not they actually asked for that ballot. All right. Then in places like California and other places, they're allowing something called ballot harvesting, which is you can walk around, you can appoint this is legal. You can appoint a third party to take your ballot from you, not a government worker, just somebody, anybody, and bring it to a polling place on your behalf. Now, how do you know it gets to the polling place? You don't. How do you know that they didn't alter the ballot after you handed it to them? You have no idea. And there's no way to keep track of any of this. So there's that problem too. Then on top of that, you have government incompetency. You've got government doing we've already had stories of governments totally screwing this up. New York is a great example of this. Just recently, they started mailing out ballots in New York. In Brooklyn, they mailed out 100,000 ballots that had the incorrect names printed on them. 100,000 ballots. And now they have to mail out 100,000 new ballots to replace those ballots. Well, what happened to the ballots that were already voted? What happened to the ballots that are just floating out there? There really aren't any good answers to those questions. And then when you add all of that, you add to all of that the fact that by allowing mail-in balloting, you allow it's very, very easy in the vast majority of the places that, in fact, I would argue in probably all of the places that allow mail-in balloting, it is extremely easy for people who are family members to vote on behalf of their family members who may or may not know that's going on, because it's so easy to get these ballots and it's so easy to get them submitted. And really all you need is information that you would know if this was your family member. So if you know that your spouse doesn't normally vote, it would be very easy for you to get their ballot for them, vote on their behalf, sign it, and send it in. And now you voted twice instead of once. And maybe your spouse doesn't normally vote and wouldn't normally vote. Maybe your spouse knows you're doing this and doesn't care.
Maybe
That's
your
not
spouse
the point.
is dead.
Maybe, or right. I mean, there are so many. The point that I'm making is, if you have a race that's decided by a few thousand votes, okay, then you have to think that this could play a factor in that race, right?
Well,
and I just want one last thing. The other thing is that in many states, they throw out a massive number of the ballots because they're concerned about voter fraud. So in New York, for example, in the primaries that they had this year, they threw out more than 20% of the ballots that were submitted.
Where?
New York. In New York, they threw out 20% of the ballots. How can anybody say that an election is valid if 20% of the ballots are being thrown out? Why? Because maybe the ink wasn't the right ink, or maybe the signature didn't match the signature they had on file perfectly, which you may have signed some form 10 years earlier, and that's the signature they're using. When you add all these things together, how can you say with any certainty that the election is a valid election unless it's a blowout? I truly don't understand how anyone can have any faith in this.
So taking into account all of those things and the potential for fraud and all the stuff that you were talking about, on a scale of 1 to 10, how concerned are you about all of that you just described?
If it's a close election, 10.
A 10.
If it's not a close election, then I don't think it really matters all that much.
So
because I don't think people will care.
So prior to the proposed expansion or the ongoing expansion of all this mail-in voting, what was your concern prior to this about all these same things?
Very, very low, because in most places you couldn't do these things. And prior to COVID, only 5 states allowed all registered voters to submit mail-in ballots for any reason at all. Most people, to do a mail-in ballot, you had to have a justification, like you weren't in your state, or you have some sort of disability or something that doesn't allow. Most people had to go to the polls to vote. In 45 states, that was the case, if I remember right. And now it's flipped. Now in 45 states, you don't have to go to the polls, and you don't need a valid justification other than I just am scared of COVID, and now you get your ballot in the mail.
And the key point here is that you don't have to ask for the ballot, which would be legit and would actually go a long way to reducing this kind of vote fraud that you're talking about, Justin. And by the way, throwing out 20% of the ballots in one election, that's actual voter suppression. So I think you finally got us a definition of that. But absentee ballots, and Trump has talked about this. He mentioned this. I know he's mentioned it on the stump. I think he mentioned it in the first debate that absentee ballots, which he has submitted over the years, are legit because you contact your voter registration office and say, I am going to be out of town or overseas or something else. I need an absentee ballot so I can vote in this election because even though I'm going to be down in Florida for the next 6 months or for the next 4 months, I actually do live up here. And I want to be able to vote for my local elected officials and state and county and all that stuff. So please give me an absentee ballot. That's legit. What these municipalities are doing is that they are mass mailing. They're just looking at the voter registration rolls, and then basically printing out an Excel spreadsheet and sending all these ballots out there to people. And there are hundreds of thousands of people on these registration rolls that are either dead or moved away or don't live there anymore. I've seen pictures on Twitter of people, they live in a home and then they have like 6 ballots and they take a picture of it and put it up there. None of these people live here anymore. It's just me. And I have all these ballots. So that person can just fill them all out and send them. So that person can vote 6 times instead of just once. We're supposed to be one man, one vote. Go to the ballot. In fact, the only way you're going to know that your vote was real and it counted is if you go to the polls. If you can go to the grocery store, you can go to your polling place. There's going to be social distancing. It's going to be fine. And that's the way you know that your vote actually counts. And hopefully there's enough of those to make up for all the fraud that's going to be happening.
So I was looking up, I was trying to find some kind of devil's advocate stuff for some of this. And to your credit, Justin, you kind of covered several of my questions just in your kind of opening monologue there. But I do want to pull up, this is a Heritage Foundation thing. This is a voter fraud map. So I was looking at this and just scroll down a little bit, Andy, and you've got like these numbers here. And it's just like, oh, wow, around 1,300 proven instances of voter fraud. Right next to that, over 1,000 criminal convictions when it comes to voter fraud. I was just like, oh, wow, I guess there's, because a lot of the devil's advocate stuff I was looking up are like kind of dismissing some of these I don't know, stories that you hear about ballots ending up in the garbage or I don't know, whatever, right? Saying that they don't amount to a whole lot, blah, blah, blah. So I was looking at this and I was like, wow, that's pretty crazy, So scroll down, Andy. There's like a map of the United States here. And you can click on any state and it'll show you these instances. So I clicked on Wisconsin because I thought Wisconsin is kind of a nice little, potential flip state, right? So click on that. And I start looking at it. And it's just like 2018, 2017, 2016. If you go to the last page on this, these instances of voter fraud go back to 2004. So I was just thinking, like, is this a new problem or is this a problem that's existed for a long, long time?
Well, the difference is that it's so much easier now to do this because of COVID. That's the difference. So you always have had voter fraud. Okay, like that's always been an issue. That's always been a problem, but not necessarily a problem so large that it's swinging national elections. Although it's possible in some states that could have been a factor, but generally speaking, that's not the case. But now what you have is you have such widespread mail-in balloting that it could be a problem. We've never had an election like this before. So you can't look at past elections and really compare anything that's happened in the past to what's happening this year, because this year is so crazy compared to what normally happens. So that's really my concern. My concern is that this is such an anomaly. No one can say, oh, don't worry about it. Well, we've never had widespread problems before. Well, we've never done this before. We've never allowed people to just millions and millions and millions of people to mail in their ballots and then have people checking the signatures, millions of signature checks. Like how, and who's checking those people checking the signature? I mean, it's just, there's so many problems with this. And that to me is the issue.
Well, I mean, like, again, just kind of looking through that heritage thing, you see these instances, and maybe they're small instances throughout the last couple of decades, but, we know from other elections that we are far from like a good system when it comes to this, whether it's the famous Florida recount in the year 2000. And like, even in my own anecdotal, experience with voting, there was one, I think it was the latest time I went to vote. The machine that you're supposed to feed all the things into was broken, and they couldn't get a hold of the person to come down and fix it. So then the judge person there was just like, "Oh, I'll just collect all of your ballots and I'll put them in later when the machine's working." And I'm just like, I'm sure that's not like good. I'm sure that's not good. Well, like you could easily just like, "Oh, not putting that one in,"
right?
It's ridiculous. So
yeah, no, that's a great point.
To me, it just seems like this is like 18th century system for voting. Like, can we move on to something? Can we move on to something better?
This is worse. They didn't even do this in the 18th century. They wouldn't have trusted this in the 18th century. They would have said, "No, this is terrible. We would never do this." They weren't that stupid back then. The reality is, this is literally never been tried before. It's just never been tried before. And there are elections, and people don't necessarily think about this, but there are elections where the vote in 2016, for example, I always use this example. I probably use this example on this show a bunch of times, but New Hampshire, look at New Hampshire in 2016. People don't even think of New Hampshire as a swing state. Donald Trump lost New Hampshire in 2016 by less than 3,000 votes. Less than 3,000 votes. And the Senate race, because we're always focused on the presidency. What about the Senate races? Those can be even closer, because you might have someone who says, "I don't like Trump, but I'm voting Republican on everything else." Well, the Senate race, if I remember right, was less than 1,000 votes. The difference was less than 1,000 votes. So if you have widespread mail-in balloting, and you have in New Hampshire that you have that happen in New Hampshire this time around, and let's say 5% of the ballots get thrown out, how can anyone know who actually won if the election is decided by 1/10% of the vote, and 10% of the vote got thrown out because of mail-in balloting, not the signatures not lining up or whatever? That's the point that I'm making, is unless it's a blowout, there's no one's going to be confident in the outcome of this race.
Isn't it about time we have some like encrypted app that just like streamlines
that's a great
all
idea.
of this?
Yeah, like the Iowa caucus app. That was a
that
good
would
idea.
great.
That was great.
Yeah, we'll get the same guys that did the Obamacare website on it. But like,
well, that's the thing. Like, that's the best argument against this whole like mail-in balloting thing. Like, you're expecting all these Democrat-run jurisdictions to be able to count ballots when they couldn't even count people at the Iowa caucuses and figure that out.
Yeah, it took like weeks to figure that out.
Right.
And then by that time, it didn't matter.
And look, the level of shenanigans that can happen in the post office, the margin for that is not zero. I mean, just yesterday, a postal worker in New Jersey was arrested for throwing away 1,800 pieces of mail, I think, including 100 ballots. So that's the guy who got caught. So you have to expand that a lot more than that. I mean, it's just, go to the polling place and vote like a normal person in a normal year. I don't understand why this has to be so complicated. I don't understand why we have to make it easier than ordering a pizza. I mean, it's just rife with fraud. And Justin's absolutely right. This is our politics in this country are very, are fraught with a lot of emotion. We seem to be split right down the middle on completely different philosophies on how to operate this country and where the country is going to go in the future. We have a political party that, if they get complete control in Washington, D.C., are going to pack the Supreme Court and change forever the relationship of the citizenry to its government. This is a really big, important election, and we're treating the voting system as if we can just, fix it on the fly and not care, and that people will actually think the election is legitimate. And I want to believe it'll be legitimate. I want to, every patriotic American should want their elections to be secure. And actually, you do that by going to the polling place and voting yourself. You shouldn't. I got mail-in ballots actually at my house. I didn't throw them away. I actually put them aside because I didn't want anything to happen to them. I didn't want anybody stealing them. But I'm not going to use them. I'm going to go to my polling place because I care about democracy.
You voted already.
Say actually, what happens about that? So actually, what happens about it? What if a ballot? It's the house I'm living in. I've lived there for 4 years. I lived in another city in Illinois for 5 years. And it could be that I'm on the voter roll in that other town, and I could have that ballot actually mailed to that place, even though I have moved. And so it could be. I mean, it could be that I would vote twice. What happens if I go to the polling place and I register, I'm registered there, my current polling place, and I vote, and then somebody finds out that I supposedly voted somewhere else because somebody took my mail-in ballot, filled it out, and sent it in. Have I committed vote fraud even though I had nothing to do with it? I mean, the number of problems with this are so immense. And nobody's even talking about it.
So I'm obviously super skeptical of all of this stuff, and this whole widespread mail-in voting. I acknowledge all of these points, and I think that it's very worrisome. I just don't think that the system was very good to begin with. And maybe it's a 10 now, and before it was like a 4 or something. But like another piece of anecdotal evidence, one of the first times I went to vote, they asked me what my last name. I said Kendal, and they're like, "Oh," and then they my brother's name. And they like hand me this ballot. I'm like, no, it's not. But like, I could have just voted for him. They don't check IDs or anything, so it doesn't matter. I could have voted for him, come back 3 hours later, and voted for me. I just think the whole system is a joke.
You should vote for you.
Well, you know what I mean.
I think that to some degree that's true, but I think there's another factor in all of this, and that is, in some ways, it almost doesn't really matter whether the voter fraud that occurs in this election is enough to actually, in reality, swing the election. What matters is that's the perception. Sure. That's the perception. That's what matters. And so in the past, you're right. Maybe the system wasn't very good. Maybe widespread voter fraud existed. Maybe there were all sorts of, but people believed in it. So, so life went on and people accepted the results. The problem with this time around is there are really, really, really good reasons not to believe in it. And once the losing side starts talking about those reasons after they lose the election and they're all mad about it, and all these stories about voter fraud start coming out, then what? Then what's going to happen? All those supporters, all those Trump supporters who've just lost and they're hearing all these stories about widespread fraud, they're just going to accept it? Or conversely, you think that the left is going to accept it if Donald Trump somehow sneaks out a win? No way.
No,
neither side is going to accept it.
With the whole West Coast.
That's right. They're going to create, what is it called? Cascadia, right? I mean, right, with Lord Biden or whatever.
Yeah.
I think...
We're out of time.
You see the point. You see the point.
No doubt. I absolutely do. And I am very concerned about it, especially if it's a close race. God forbid. All right. That's it. We thank you for joining us for this episode of the In the Tank podcast. Join us every Friday for a new episode of In the Tank. If you like our show, please subscribe, rate a review for us on iTunes. It'd be greatly appreciated. You can find us on pretty much everything: SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google, YouTube, everything nowadays. If you'd like, you can follow us on Twitter, socialist Twitter, at In the Tank Pod. You can send us your comments, suggestions, and questions to the show by emailing us at inthetankpodcast@gmail.com. Justin, where can the fine people find you?
Justin T. Haskins on Facebook and socialist Twitter. Look for the big, beautiful blue check mark. Still there.
Jim,
don't forget to talk about Tucker Carlson, Justin. You're on that show weekly now. You're big time.
I know, but they're upsetting me. They're upsetting me.
That's what the rant at the beginning.
We don't want to go back down that road again. That's it.
Jim Lakely, where can the fine people find you?
At J Lakely on socialist Twitter. You can also visit heartland.org to keep up with what we're doing.
And Isaac Orr, last but not least.
Hey, least and last, Isaac Orr at the Fracking Guy on Twitter and at AmericanExperiment.org.
Thank you all for tuning in. We will talk to you next week.